The airport hummed with life. Announcements echoed overhead. Travelers rushed past with rolling suitcases, and tired faces glanced at departure screens. Tom Cruise sat in the VIP lounge, sunglasses hooked onto his collar, scrolling through his phone. He had spent weeks on the road promoting his latest film, and now a delayed flight left him with unexpected free time. A few seats away, a single father sat slumped forward, elbows on his knees, fingers pressed against his temples. He looked exhausted, lost in thought, staring blankly at the floor. Beside him, a small boy, no older than 6, balanced on a suitcase, hugging a stuffed airplane. Unlike his father, the child looked content, swinging his feet softly. But something about the way he clutched the toy so tightly hinted that he sensed more than he let on. Tom noticed, and he didn't just look away. Years in the spotlight had taught him to read a room, to see beyond the surface. There was something about this father and son that made him pause. Suddenly, the boy's stuffed airplane slipped from his hands, tumbling across the floor, stopping right at Tom's feet. The father didn't even notice, too weighed down by whatever was on his mind. Tom bent down, picked up the small toy, and turned it in his hands, feeling the worn fabric. Then, with a small smile, he walked over. "I think this belongs to you," he said, kneeling slightly as he handed it back to the child. The little boy's face lit up. "Thank you, sir." Only then did the father look up. His tired eyes met Tom's, and in that single glance, everything changed. The father blinked, as if snapping out of a trance. He hadn't even noticed his son drop the toy. "Thank you," he muttered, his voice rough with exhaustion. Tom gave a small nod and was about to return to his seat, but something made him hesitate. The father looked worn down, not just from travel, but from something deeper. The boy clutched his stuffed airplane and leaned against his dad, still smiling from the interaction. But the father barely reacted. He just sat there, staring at the ground, his fingers rubbing the boarding pass crumpled in his hands. Tom had seen that look before. A man carrying the weight of something he wasn't saying. Glancing around, Tom noticed that most people were glued to their phones or lost in their own worlds. No one else seemed to see him. So he made a decision. Instead of walking away, he pulled out the seat next to them and sat down. The father tensed slightly, surprised. "Rough night?" Tom asked casually. The father let out a tired chuckle, shaking his head. "Rough year." His voice carried a quiet defeat, the kind that comes when someone has tried for too long and still feels like they're losing. The little boy, unaware of the shift in mood, hummed softly as he played with his toy. Tom leaned back in his seat. "I don't mean to pry, but you look like you've got a lot on your mind." The father hesitated. His eyes flickered toward his son before exhaling deeply. He looked like a man who wasn't used to talking about his struggles, but maybe, for once, he needed to. "You ever feel like, no matter what you do, it's never enough?" he finally asked. Tom nodded. He had felt that before. But right now, it wasn't about him. It was about the man sitting next to him, on the verge of saying something he hadn't admitted out loud before. Tom didn't rush to respond. He knew when to talk, and, more importantly, when to listen. The father stared at the floor for a long moment before shaking his head. "I love my son more than anything," he murmured. "But some days, I wonder if I'm failing him." Tom glanced at the little boy, who was now making his stuffed airplane fly through the air, lost in his own world. "What makes you think that?" Tom asked. The father exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "I lost my wife 2 years ago. It was just supposed to be a routine doctor's visit. 1 minute, we were planning our future. The next, I was standing in a hospital hallway, realizing I had to raise our son alone. Tom's expression softened. He knew loss. He knew grief. And he knew the way it never really left. It just changed shape. "I'm so sorry," Tom said sincerely. The father nodded but didn't look up. "I promised I'd do everything to take care of him, to make her proud. But some days, man," he ran a hand down his face, "some days, I don't even know if I'm enough." Tom leaned forward slightly. "He looks at you like you hung the moon. You know that, right?" The father glanced at his son, who was still happily playing, completely unaware of the conversation, happening just inches away. "Yeah," he whispered, "but what happens when he realizes I have no idea what I'm doing?" Tom let out a quiet chuckle. "Newsflash, none of us do." The father blinked, as if surprised by the honesty. "You think I've had life figured out from the start?" Tom continued, shaking his head. "I've made mistakes, big ones. I've doubted myself more times than I can count. But I'll tell you what I've learned." He paused, letting the words settle before saying, "Being a good parent isn't about having all the answers. It's about showing up. And my friend, you're here." The father swallowed hard, his gaze lingering on his son. Something shifted in his expression. A flicker of realization. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't failing. And for the first time that night, he sat up just a little straighter. The father sat in silence, absorbing Tom's words. "Just showing up," he repeated under his breath, as if testing how it felt. Tom nodded. "It's more than most people do." The little boy, still playing, suddenly tugged at his father's sleeve. "Daddy, I'm hungry." The father quickly reached for his wallet, flipping through it. His fingers froze. Tom saw it before the father could hide it. Only a few crumpled bills remained. The father exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. "I thought I had more." Tom, without hesitation, waved over a lounge attendant. "Hey, can we get some food for my friend and his son here? Put it on my tab." The father stiffened. "No, I can't." Tom held up a hand. "Let me do this." Call it a favor from one guy who's been through some tough times to another. The little boy beamed. "Thank you, mister." The father, however, was still rigid, staring at the table. Tom could tell this wasn't just about money. Finally, the father let out a long sigh. "You want the truth?" he said quietly. Tom didn't flinch. "Always." The father swallowed hard. "This flight, it's one way." Tom's expression shifted. "I sold our car. Our apartment lease is up next month. I took everything we had left and bought 2 plane tickets." He exhaled sharply. "I told my son we were starting fresh. But the truth is, I have no plan, no job waiting for me. Just a city I barely know, and a hope that somehow I'll figure it out." The words hung in the air like a weight. Tom didn't judge. He didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he leaned in slightly and asked, "What made you pick this city?" The father hesitated. "It's where my wife and I always dreamed of raising him." Tom sat back, nodding slowly. "Then, maybe you're not lost. Maybe you're just following the dream she started." The father blinked rapidly, caught off guard. He hadn't thought about it that way. For the first time that night, he didn't feel like he was running. He felt like he was moving forward. The father sat frozen, replaying Tom's words in his head. "Maybe you're not lost. Maybe you're just following the dream she started. For the first time in a long while, his decision didn't feel like a mistake. Tom leaned forward. "What do you do?" The father hesitated. "I was a mechanic." Tom nodded. "So, you fix things." The father gave a small chuckle. "Yeah, I guess." Tom tapped his phone. "I know someone in your new city, a friend who runs a high-end car restoration shop. He's always looking for skilled hands. Want me to make a call?" The father blinked. "You're serious?" Tom smiled. "I don't joke about things like this." A long pause. The father had spent months struggling, feeling like he was sinking. And now, out of nowhere, someone was offering him a way forward. Before he could answer, his son piped up. "Say yes, Daddy." A laugh escaped the father's lips, the first real one in months. He turned to Tom, his eyes shining with disbelief and hope. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I'd like that." Tom nodded. "Then it's done." And just like that, everything changed. The father sat there, still stunned. What had started as another exhausting day had just turned into something he never could have imagined. Tom leaned back in his seat, watching the little boy happily finish his meal. "You're going to be just fine," he said with certainty. "Both of you," the father exhaled, nodding. "I don't even know how to thank you." Tom smiled. "Just pay it forward someday." The father looked down at his son, then back at Tom. "I will." The final boarding call for their flight echoed through the lounge. The father stood, adjusting his son's jacket. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel lost. Before parting, Tom extended his hand. The father shook it firmly, no longer feeling like a man barely holding on, but one finally standing on solid ground. As he walked away, his little boy looked back and waved. "Bye, mister." Tom waved back with a grin. He knew this wasn't just a chance encounter. It was exactly what was meant to happen. Sometimes, the right people cross our paths at the right moments, and in those moments, hope is restored, futures are rewritten, and lives are changed forever. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on those who've lifted you up when you needed it most. And if you can, be that person for someone else. Share this story, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the power of human kindness. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this.